Rosh Chodesh Tov, Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Mishnayot Demai, Perek Gimel, Mishnah Bet. The Mishnah is going to discuss now, this Mishnah and the following Mishnayot, a number of cases, situations where a person has to take care that Tevel and Demai do not come in the hands of an Amaretz who might eat it without separating the Maasrot, which again is a violation. הרוצה לחזום עליה רק להקל ממסעו, לא ישליך עד שיסער. הרוצה לחזום, the מפרשים explain, there's no other source for this word, but the word means to cut. One who wants to cut עליה רק, he wants to trim the edible leaves of the vegetables that he is carrying. He's carrying a load of vegetables that are tevel or demai, and he wants to trim off a number of edible leaves from the vegetables, to lighten the burden. He may not discard these trimmed vegetable leaves by the roadside until he first tides them. Why? Because the Mifarshim explain, we are concerned that the discarded leaves will be found by an Amaretz, who might come to eat it without separating the proper Maasrot. Now, the Rav points out that we learned in the Masechet Pe'ah, in the beginning of the Masechet, if you look at Masechet Pe'ah, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Vav, that produce that is hefker, ownerless, is not subject to any separations. There's no ties that you do by ownerless produce until the produce is fully processed, which is when the requirement to tithe comes into effect. So the Rav tells us that for vegetables, when does the obligation to separate the tithes come into effect? When they are packed into bundles. Once the vegetables are packed into bundles, now the requirement to tithe takes effect. So our Mishnah, which says that you have to tithe the vegetable leaves that you're trimming from to lighten the burden, it's talking about a case where the vegetables are packed into bundles, which is why it's required that you should separate the tithes. The Mefarshim also explain the Mishnah is talking about any produce that a person throws away on the side of the road. It's specifically singled out the leaves of vegetables to show you even something so insignificant and unlikely that it's going to be claimed by anyone, still you have to tithe it before you put it on the side, because it's possible that someone will take it and come to eat it without separating the tithes. Now, the next part of the Mishnah is going to discuss different situations of buying and returning produce if you have to tithe it. But as a background, we have to know, how does a person acquire something in Judaism? How does a sale take effect? So the Mefarshim explained to us, and it's brought down very much in depth in Masechet Kiddushin, that a sale is only considered final when the buyer performs a kinyan, which we know is an act of acquiring ownership, of taking ownership, with the intention of taking ownership. So he acquires the item. He doesn't act to acquire the item with the intent to own it. Now, that's when he fully acquires it. By movable items, by tangible items, it's what we call kinyan mishicha, either pulling, or kinyan hagba'ah, lifting the item, depending on which item it is. Once you either lift the item or pull the item with the intent to acquire it, you own the merchandise now, even if the money hasn't been paid yet, as long as there's a set price. I tell the guy, I'm going to pay you $100 for the phone. I lift the phone up with the intent to acquire it. I have fully acquired the phone according to biblical law, even though I didn't give you the $100 yet. Once the kinyan is performed, if I want to return the merchandise back to the seller, it's considered a new sale. It's not called returning, I'm giving you back. I have to resell it to you. Because since I acquired it, I have to resell it to you to give it back to you. So Mishnah now is going to speak about a case of a buyer of produce who wants to return the produce that he just bought. הלוקח ירק מן השוק ונמלח להחזיר, a person who is buying bundles of vegetables. There's a set price. They have agreed. Either the market value is a set price, $5 per bundle, or they set a price themselves, and you're buying it from an Amaretz seller in the marketplace. And the buyer now, since he knows how much the set price is, he lifts up a bundle with the intent to take ownership. So he did a kinyan. And before he counts how much bundles he has for the total amount that he has to pay the seller, he changes his mind and he wants to give it back to the storekeeper. You know what? Never mind. I don't want it. The Mishnah says that you may not return the bundles to the seller until you tithe it. Why? Because since you, the buyer, have legally, according to Torah law, acquired these vegetables by picking it up with the intent to own it, now they are yours. If you want to return it to the seller, you are in effect selling it back to him. And the rule is, we know, you are not allowed to sell Demai to an Amaretz because he might come to eat it without tithing it. You have to tithe it yourself before you give it to him. Because the Mishnah says, why is the sale considered complete? Because at this point there is a set price per bundle. The only thing that's mechusar, the only thing that is missing, that is lacking, is the number of bundles that you selected for the final amount. Since the only information needed is the final amount, the sale is considered valid. Since you, in effect, you agreed to how much you're going to pay per unit. And the Rab tells us, but the amount of maaser that is being separated, the value has to be returned to the buyer, and the Rab explains, because once you pick it up, you acquire it, and you are obligated to tithe it. The Mishnah continues. If, however, he didn't pick up the vegetables, he was in the middle of purchasing it, he was standing in the middle of purchasing it, he was holding the load of vegetables, he didn't lift it up yet, it was passed over to him, right? He didn't even hold it. It's there on the table, the buyer didn't lift it up yet, it was set aside, he wants it. He saw another load of vegetables on the side that was better than the first one, and he wants to buy that instead. The Mishnah says that you are allowed to return it, meaning not purchase it, let the seller keep it without taking off maaser, because you didn't acquire it, you didn't perform mishicha, or in the case of vegetables, hagbah. In essence, what the Mishnah is telling us, that since the buyer never owned it, since he never made a kinyan, he never acquired it biblically, it wasn't a real sale, therefore returning them is not considered reselling the demai, and therefore the buyer is not responsible to tithe them, because it never came into his possession. Because this case is haya omed v'lokeach. He wasn't holding it. He was in the middle of purchasing it. It was down. It was set on the side. He didn't acquire it yet. In that case, he can give it back without having to separate any of the tithes. Mishnah Gimel now is going to continue in this logic of when you transfer ownership. That's the acquiring the item by performing the kinyan. So now the Mishnah says, "Hamotze perot baderech untalan leochlan." A person who's walking on the road and he finds produce on the road and he picks it up with the intent to eat it, he wants to acquire it for himself. Obviously, we're talking about a item that has no siman, and therefore the halakha is that you'd be allowed to keep it since there's no identifiable mark. And also we're talking about a produce that has reached the stage where it needs to be tithed. So you found this produce on the road, you picked it up with the intent to eat it, meaning you want to acquire it. And then you know what, you changed your mind after you picked it up and you said, I don't want to keep it anymore. I'm going to put it in a sheltered spot on the side of the road for anyone to take. He puts it in a protected spot so that animals or birds won't be able to reach it. The Mishnah says, Lo yatzniya ad shiyaser. He's not allowed to put this produce in the sheltered spot until he tithes it, because as soon as he lifts up the produce, again with the intent to eat it, meaning he wants to acquire it, it becomes his. So when he wants to leave the produce now for other people to take, he is discarding his own demai produce since he acquired it. And you're not allowed to leave demai produce, you have to first tithe it before you discard it. And we say that since the status of this produce is not known, automatically it has the status of demai. However, if he originally took the produce from the side of the road to protect it, it shouldn't be destroyed. He never meant to take ownership of it. He didn't want it to eat it. He just took it because he didn't want it to be destroyed. So he moved it. Patur, he's exempt from tithing it, and the Mifalshim explained why. Since he didn't want to take ownership of the produce for himself, it never became his, and he never had the obligation upon himself to tithe it before he puts it down. Now, we learned previously in Parak Bet, Mishnah Dalid, the Chachamim gave rules for how much produce a person sells, what type of produce, if you have to take off maaser before you sell it or not. We said anything that's generally sold in a large quantity, bulk, since you don't make a lot of money, Chachamim do not require you to separate the tithes. However, smaller sales of produce, like by kitniot, by beans, since you make a lot of profit, by retail sellers, they have to separate the demai. So the Mishnah now is going to apply the law to a gift. Kol davar she'en adam rashay lemochot demai. whatever a person is not allowed to sell because it's demai, meaning a small quantity of demai, like the beans, and therefore you're not allowed to sell without tithing. Lo yishlach lechavero demai, you likewise may not send it as a gift to his friend if it's demai. Even if you tell the recipient, you tell the person, I'm giving you a gift, but it's demai, you're still not allowed to give it to him. Why? We're afraid that the recipient's going to forget what the giver told him and eat it while it's untithed. Now, Rabbi Yossi matir bevadai ubilvad shiotienu. Rabbi Yossi agrees with the sages that you're not allowed to give demai, even if you tell the person, but he disagrees that you're allowed to sell, you're allowed to give a small amount of tevel as a gift, as long as you are telling the person that the gift you're giving him is untithed. And the Mefarshim explain, Rabbi Yossi is not concerned that the person who is getting the produce is going to forget and eat it, because again, since it's tevel, the person is more strict about it. And likewise by the giver. Rabbi Yossi is not afraid the giver is going to forget, because again, since it's tevel, since it's very severe, we assume that he's going to tell it to him. And now Rabbi Yossi, obviously, like we said, he only permits you to give tevel as a gift. He agrees you're now to sell tevel. We're going to see later on, even if you tell him. And regarding the gift, according to Rabbi Yossi, since it's only a small amount, Chachamim were lenient, they're allowed to give it. However, again, like we said, Rabbi Yossi does agree, since the demai prohibition is very, in people's eyes, not so severe, like the prohibition of tevel, which is chiyuv mita b'dei shamayim, Rabbi Yossi is concerned even there that you're not allowed to give demai as a gift, because the giver might forget to tell the recipient that he didn't tithe it. The halakha does not follow Rabbi Yossi, the halakha follows the chachamim. You're not allowed to gift your friend even demai, just like you're not allowed to sell the demai if it's a small quantity. For sure, you're not allowed to gift him tevel. In any event, that is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Everybody should have a Rosh Chodesh Tov. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.